The clock on the wall of Chuck Norris's Texas ranch read 3:07 in the morning. Outside, the night was dead quiet. No wind, no crickets, just the kind of silence that settles deep into the bones of the countryside. Chuck was asleep, the way a man sleeps when his conscience is clear and his life is ordered. 60 years of discipline will do that to a person. You don't toss and turn when you've made peace with who you are. Then his phone rang. Not a soft buzz, not a gentle chime. A full, loud, old-fashioned ring that cut through the darkness like a blade. His wife stirred. Chuck opened one eye, the kind of calm, measured response you'd expect from a man who has trained his entire life never to panic. He reached over slowly, looked at the screen, and stopped. The name glowing on that phone was one he hadn't seen calling at this hour in 20 years. Steven Seagal. Chuck sat up slowly, his broad shoulders filling the shadow of the room. He stared at the name for one more ring, then answered. His voice was steady, not groggy, not surprised, just steady. Steven. On the other end, there was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause that tells you more than words can. Then came a voice, deep and quiet, the unmistakable low tone of Steven Seagal, but something in it was different. It wasn't the calm, commanding voice the world knew from movies or martial arts halls. There was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like weight, like a man carrying something heavy and finally deciding to set it down. "Chuck," Seagal said, "I need to talk to you." Chuck didn't ask why. He didn't ask what time it was, or suggest they speak in the morning. He just said, "I'm listening." And that was it. Two legends, separated by hundreds of miles of American darkness, connected by a single phone call at 3 in the morning. Nobody knew it was happening. No cameras, no audience, no internet. Just two old warriors alone with the truth. What was said in that call would take days to reach the world, but when it did, nobody was ready for it. To understand why that phone call mattered, you have to understand who these men are. Not the movie versions, not the action hero posters, the real versions. Steven Seagal began studying martial arts as a teenager in California. He was a serious, intense young man who didn't fit neatly into any crowd. He traveled to Japan, trained under real masters, lived on the mat, learned the ancient discipline of Aikido until he didn't just practice it, but breathed it. He became the first Westerner ever to run an Aikido dojo in Japan. Think about what that means for a moment. In a culture that takes martial arts tradition more seriously than almost anything else, a young American from Lansing, Michigan, earned the respect of Japanese masters so completely that they handed him a dojo. That doesn't happen because of talent alone. That happens because of character. He came back to America, eventually made movies, became famous, but the martial arts world always knew the truth. Seagal wasn't pretending on screen. The wrist locks, the redirections, the breathtaking calm under pressure, that was real, every bit of it. Chuck Norris had his own story. Born in Ryan, Oklahoma, a quiet kid who discovered martial arts while serving in the United States Air Force in Korea. He came home and built something extraordinary. He studied, competed, and won the professional middleweight karate championship 6 times in a row. 6 times. He opened schools across America and trained generations of fighters. He starred in films that showed a different kind of hero, not flashy, not loud, just relentless, disciplined, and decent. These two men had crossed paths over the decades in the way that legends do. Mutual respect from a distance, nods of acknowledgement at events, brief conversations at ceremonies, but they had never been truly close. Different styles, different personalities, different paths through the same world. Seagal was fire wrapped in stillness. Norris was bedrock, quiet and immovable. So when Seagal called at 3 in the morning, Chuck knew it wasn't casual. Back on that phone call, Seagal spoke slowly.
He told Chuck about something that had happened 3 weeks earlier at a large martial arts event in Asia. Most of the story had already gone partially viral. A young Taekwondo champion named Ethan Lee had challenged him publicly, mocked him in front of thousands, called his skills Hollywood fairy tales. Seagal had responded not with anger, but with a demonstration so calm, so precise, so utterly controlled that it left the entire arena speechless. The young man had eventually bowed, genuinely humbled, and a moment that could have been ugly became something beautiful. Chuck had seen the clips, everybody had, but that wasn't why Seagal was calling. After the event, Seagal said quietly, I went back to my hotel room and I sat there in the dark for a long time, Chuck. A long time. Chuck said nothing. He just listened. The kid reminded me of someone, Seagal continued. He reminded me of who I was at that age, all that fire, all that pride, thinking speed was power, thinking being the best in the room meant something permanent. He paused again. I wasn't kind to everyone back then, you know that. Chuck let out a long, slow breath. I know, he said simply. This was the part nobody expected, not from Steven Seagal, because the image the world had of him was iron, unshakable, the man who never flinched, never bent, never doubted. But on this phone call, in the middle of a silent Texas night, one of the most feared martial artists on earth was saying something that required more courage than any physical technique ever could. He was admitting he had been wrong. The story that came out over the following days, pieced together from interviews and eventually confirmed by both men, went like this. In the early years of their careers, Seagal and Chuck had attended a similar martial arts tournament in Los Angeles. Seagal was young, sharp, already building his reputation. Chuck was already established, already respected, moving through the room with the quiet dignity of a man who had earned everything he had. Seagal, in front of a large crowd, had made a comment, not a direct insult, more like the kind of remark that a confident young man makes when he wants the room to notice him. A joke at Chuck's expense, something about old styles versus new thinking, something that drew laughs and drew attention exactly the way it was meant to. Chuck had simply looked at him, calm, direct, no anger, no comeback, just a look that said more than any words could. Then he walked away. The crowd laughed, some of them at Chuck's expense, others nervously. Seagal had told himself it was harmless, just the competitive banter of the martial arts world. But over the years, that moment sat in the back of his mind like a small stone in a shoe, not painful enough to stop walking, but always there, always present, especially on quiet nights when the noise of the world fell away and you were left alone with the truth of who you really were. Watching Ethan Lee mock him at that event had cracked something open, because he had seen himself so clearly in that young man's eyes, the pride, the performance, the need to be seen as the best in the room, and he had watched himself, through Ethan, finally understand what that really looks like from the outside. It doesn't look strong, it looks afraid. Why call me at 3 in the morning? Chuck asked, not accusingly, genuinely. Seagal's answer was quiet but firm. I've been carrying this for 30 years, Chuck, and I didn't want to carry it for 30 more. He took a breath. I was wrong to say what I said back then. You didn't deserve it. You never did anything but carry yourself with honor, and I used you for a cheap laugh. I'm sorry. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Chuck Norris, a man whose life philosophy was built on the idea that real strength means taking responsibility, sat in his dark bedroom and felt something shift, not because he had been waiting for an apology, not because the old comment had wounded him deeply or stayed with him, but because of what the apology represented. Here was a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose by being vulnerable, choosing truth over image, choosing humility over the armor that fame and ego build around you over decades. You didn't have to call, Chuck said. I know, Seagal replied. That's why I called. 3 words. That's why I called. Chuck said later in an interview that those 3 words hit him harder than any punch he had ever taken on a mat. Because real apologies aren't made because they have to be. Real apologies are made because the person giving them has grown big enough inside to make room for their mistakes. Chuck said, "I respect you, Stephen. I always have, even then." And that was when Seagal, one of the most physically formidable human beings alive, went quiet for a long moment, because that response, that simple, gracious response from a man who had every right to be cold, was harder to receive than any takedown on any mat in the world. Accepting forgiveness requires as much courage as asking for it.
They talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the old incident. That was settled in the first 5 minutes, and then it was simply gone. Dissolved the way something can only dissolve when both people are ready to let it go. They talked about other things. The state of martial arts, what it meant to them when they were young, and what it meant to them now. The weight of having millions of people look at you as a symbol of something. The loneliness of fame. The strange responsibility that comes with it. At one point, Chuck said, "When you've been at this long enough, you realize the hardest opponent isn't in any dojo. It's the version of yourself that wants to stay comfortable. The part that doesn't want to grow, because growing means admitting you were smaller before." Seagal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent decades being the most dangerous person in the room. It took me this long to understand that the most dangerous thing in any room isn't a fighter. It's a man who has nothing left to prove." Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Nothing left to prove. That's not weakness. That's the highest level a person can reach. When your confidence is so deep, so rooted in who you are, that you don't need anyone else to confirm it. You don't need applause. You don't need the crowd. You don't need to win the argument or the sparring match or the room. You just are who you are, and that's enough. Most people spend their whole lives chasing that feeling and never finding it. These 2 men had found it through decades of discipline, sacrifice, and eventually honest self-examination. By morning, Chuck's wife found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out at the Texas sunrise. She asked him who had called in the middle of the night. "Steven Seagal," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "At 3 in the morning? Is everything all right?" Chuck smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that holds a lot of things in it. "Everything's better than all right," he said. He didn't explain further that morning, but later, after both men had agreed to speak publicly about the call, Chuck described that moment this way in an interview. "I sat there watching the sun come up over my land, and I thought about how long we spend in life protecting ourselves from honesty, building walls, wearing armor, pretending we don't have any regrets, and how much energy all of that takes. Stephen made a call that most people would never make, and it didn't make him look weak. It made him look like a giant." When the story broke online, the reaction was unlike anything either man had expected. Not because people were shocked by the apology itself, though many were, but because of how rare it is to see 2 men at the top of their fields choose humility over image. In a world that constantly rewards loudness, rewards the performance of confidence, rewards the person who never backs down and never admits fault, here were 2 legends choosing something different. The internet, which can be a brutal place, responded with something it doesn't always offer: genuine admiration. Comment sections filled with things like, "This is what real men look like," and "I've been waiting my whole life to see this kind of honesty from people I look up to." One comment that got hundreds of thousands of likes simply said, "They could have kept this private. They chose to share it so others could learn. That's what a teacher does." Martial arts communities around the world shared the story, not the parts about their skills or their films or their records, the part about a phone call, the part about 2 old warriors sitting with their ghosts and choosing to finally set them down. Young fighters began posting about it. Some talked about people in their own lives they had wronged and never apologized to, about moments of pride they had chosen over truth, about the version of themselves they knew they needed to leave behind. One 17-year-old kid from Brazil posted a video that itself went viral. He sat in front of his phone, visibly nervous, and said, "I watched the Seagal and Norris story,
and I went and called my old coach who I disrespected 2 years ago and quit on. I apologized. He cried. I cried. I didn't know an apology could feel like winning. That video got shared by Seagal himself. He added no caption, just a single word: respect. Weeks later, Seagal and Chuck appeared together publicly for the first time since the call. Not at a film premiere, not at a martial arts competition, at a youth center in Houston, Texas, where a program trains at-risk teenagers through martial arts and discipline. No press conference, no photographers invited. Someone in the audience happened to record it on their phone, and that's how the world found out. The two men walked onto a worn mat in a modest gymnasium, surrounded by maybe 40 teenagers who looked like they'd seen enough of life's hard edges to be skeptical of almost everything. They stood side by side, these two legendary figures, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then Chuck addressed the kids directly. His voice was unhurried and warm. "I want you to look at the man standing next to me. He called me at 3 in the morning to say he was sorry for something that happened 30 years ago, not because he had to, because he chose to. That takes more strength than anything you will ever see in a ring or on a mat. You want to know what a warrior really looks like? That's it right there." The kids looked at Seagal. He looked back at them, steady as stone, but his eyes were different from the cool steel of his public image. Warmer, more present. He said, "I spent most of my life being the best fighter in the room. I trained harder than almost anyone. I won more than most, and I still had something to learn at 70 years old." He paused. "None of your trophies will tell you who you are. None of your wins will show you your character. The only thing that will show you your character is what you do when you're wrong. Do you run from it, or do you walk towards it?" One of the teenagers, a kid in the back row with his arms crossed and the practiced look of someone who trusts nobody, slowly uncrossed his arms.
After the session, as Seagal and Chuck were leaving, one of the teenagers ran up behind them. He was maybe 15, small for his age, wearing a hoodie that was a size too big. He tapped Seagal on the shoulder. Seagal turned around. "Is it hard?" the kid asked, not intimidated, just honest. "Saying sorry?" Seagal looked at him for a long moment. Then he crouched down slightly so they were eye level, which, if you know how physically imposing Seagal is, tells you something about how much care he put into that moment. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done," he said quietly. "And I've trained in some of the most difficult dojos on the planet, walked into rooms full of people who wanted to test me, faced things that would make most people run. None of it was as hard as making that phone call." The kid nodded slowly, processing it. "But you did it anyway," the kid said. Seagal stood back up. "That's what makes it matter." The story of that 3 a.m. phone call became something bigger than either man intended. It became a kind of lesson that didn't require a mat or a uniform or any physical skill at all. It became a story about the fight that most people never talk about, the internal one, the fight against your own pride, your own ego, your own carefully constructed story about who you are and what you're allowed to feel. Chuck Norris, in one of his final public statements about the whole thing, put it simply: "Champions are made in training. Characters are made in moments of honesty." Steven showed more character in that phone call than most people show in a lifetime. And I've been in this world long enough to know that's the rarest kind of strength there is. Seagal never gave a long speech about it. He didn't write a book or do a documentary. He went back to his dojo, back to teaching, back to the quiet life he had always chosen when the cameras stopped rolling. But something had shifted. You could see it in the clips from his classes that students occasionally posted. A softness that had always been there beneath the iron surface, now a little more visible. A willingness to show not just mastery, but the cost of mastery. The years of mistakes that a person has to be honest about before they can truly teach anything real. And in gyms and dojos and youth centers and living rooms across the world, people kept sharing that story. Parents played it for their kids. Coaches played it for their teams. Teachers played it for their classes. Not the fighting parts, the phone call part, because that was the part that changed things. Two men, one phone call, 3 in the morning,
and a lesson that said everything you need to know about what real strength looks like when the lights are off and nobody's watching, and the only person left in the room is you. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think of a call you've been putting off, an apology you've been carrying, something you've been too proud to say out loud, then you already know what you need to do. The hardest fights don't happen on the mat. They happen at 3 in the morning when you're alone with the truth of who you are and who you want to become. Real warriors don't just train their bodies, they train their hearts. Type respect in the comments if this story hit different. And tell us honestly, is there a call you need to make? Because if Seagal could do it after 30 years, so can you.